This program was brought to you by Koller Institute of Venture at Tel Aviv University.
Good afternoon. I'd like to start by having everyone move and talk for just a second. I'm a little bit cold. I don't know, maybe you are as well. But what I would like to start with is if you could just turn to your neighbor and ask them if they heard of the gentleman that Eli Talmor mentioned in his talk, who is Yigal Erlich, who's the founder of Yozma. If you've read Startup Nation, you most likely have, and if you're Israeli, I'm sure that you have. But if you could just turn to your neighbor and ask them if they've heard of Yozma and Yigal Erlich.
You get 3 points if yes, 4 if no.
Okay, how many of your neighbors have heard of Yozma? Show of hands, please. Okay, great. So if your neighbor had heard of Yozma, they're not alone. Yozma has been a phenomenon internationally and has been the center of my research, actually. So this is research that I've put together on how Yozma has traveled globally. And what I found is at least 40 countries have now replicated the Israeli model, the Startup Nation model, if you will. You'll see big countries on this list, small countries, emerging economies, major economies. And what this represents is not only a Yozma replication. What this particular chart represents is efforts that governments have initiated to support specifically venture capital, which was the focus of Yozma, which, to explain to those who haven't heard of it, it was the Israeli government fund, a VC fund, that effectively created the Israeli VC market beginning in 1992-93. It was an overwhelming success and was privatized by 1998. Okay, so as they would say in Vietnam, what's been replicated from the Israeli model is same, but different, right? So if you've ever tried to buy something from a hawker in Vietnam, you'll say, okay, perfect, I want this one. And you go to buy it, and they bring something around from the side, and they say, no, same, but different. So this is the way that the Yozma model and the support of venture capital has diffused globally. And I won't get into the details of this. This is the outcome of some of my PhD research. But what I've found is that each country has done something at least slightly different. And I think more than slightly different, I think it's important differences. So each country has worked to, as Yeshua said, it's very important, as policymakers have demonstrated over and over again, to support venture capital. But the means by which they've done that has been markedly different over the course of the last 30 years in at least these 40 countries. So how have these differences shaken out? What are the different tools that policymakers have to support venture? So in the shameless promotion again for the publication, in the publication that's in the back of the room, which Yesha's article features as well, I've detailed the 8 categories of ways in which policymakers, nations, cities, regions have and can support venture activities. And so these 8 categories is how I'm going to spend the rest of my time with you this afternoon. These 8 categories are funding, taxation, regulation, clusters, networks, institutes, attracting talent and investment, technology infrastructure, stock market access, education and training. All things that you would probably intuitively expect to be on this list, but I'm going to go into specifically how governments have done that so far. I'm really happy after this talk as well, during the coffee break, if you'd like to talk about how different countries have implemented initiatives across these 8 categories, how sometimes they work and sometimes they don't, and they lead to sort of ghost cities or efforts that aren't just a great use of tax dollars. Okay, so first, funding. Yozma is my favorite example of the ways in which government has effectively used $100 million to create an entire industry, but there's other means by which governments have funded venture. So equity investments directly in venture firms, directly in startups, loans as well, guarantees so that private actors have their risk limited when they invest in the risky venture world, funds of VC funds. This is specifically aimed at Yozma, of course, grants, and public R&D. So these are the ways in which the government is able to and has funded the venture ecosystem. Taxation, increasing pressure downwards on tax rates, of course, and governments have picked up on this internationally and have carved out their niche to attract startups, to attract investors by offering low or no tax rates, both for investors and for startup firms. Similarly, Taiwan is a great example of a government that has used a tax credit to encourage investment in the venture capital asset class and in startups specifically, saying that your total tax liabilities will be decreased by X%. In the case of Taiwan, 20% if you invest in high-risk startups. In IT, I should mention, specifically in the Taiwanese case. So this is a way of focusing on one specific sector as well within venture. And finally, tax credits for public R&D. Third, regulation has been a hugely popular category in which countries have implemented different efforts to become a regional, an international hub for activity. So adopting the limited partnership structure, obviously hugely important for growing a venture capital market, ensuring and tightening up the IP environment to promote and protect those who are innovating. Bankruptcy laws, a word about bankruptcy laws, particularly thinking about the Japanese case, to ensure that there's an environment by which entrepreneurs are not really discouraged from starting a business. Bankruptcy laws have been changed so that you're able to quickly close down a company so that entrepreneurs are not penalized for trying to start a business and having to close it down. So in some environments, such as Japan historically, if you were a quote-unquote failed entrepreneur, which is a good thing in some places, it's a good thing in the US in many respects, and it's a good thing, I think, in a lot of the Israeli culture. You know, a failed business is actually an experienced entrepreneur. When in some markets, bankruptcy laws would prohibit someone who had filed bankruptcy from starting another company for 5 or 10 or 15 years. So then you're taking away the pool of talent, basically, that has experience starting a business and running a business. Other regulatory tools that have been used, reducing fundraising restrictions. In some markets, again, my research area has been targeted specifically at different Asian markets, and this has been a real constraint where startups are not able, and then venture capital investors are not able to raise money from certain investors. How many have heard of the ERISA prudent man rule in the US? Okay. I was hoping and expecting, I suppose, the front folks to raise their hand. This is considered a crucial regulatory change in the US that facilitated the growth of the venture capital asset class. Why? So in 1979, the Department of Labor reinterpreted what they believed to be a risky investment, saying effectively that pension funds no longer would be prohibited from investing in the venture capital asset class because this was no longer a risky investment in this respect. So all of a sudden, pension funds, a hugely important investor class for venture, was able to invest in the US. So in the slide that I showed with the real uptick in this diffusion of Yosma and the diffusion of venture activity in terms of policymaking, I expected, looking into that, and maybe intuitively you would expect as well, to see that this fundamental reinterpretation of ERISA in 1979 in the US, which was credited with the growth of venture capital in the US, would have traveled. That ERISA-like regulation that allowed pension funds to invest in the venture capital asset class, you would expect that to travel. Amazingly, to my research, I didn't find that it's traveled in almost any case. There are still huge amounts of restrictions around how pension funds and how these major institutional investors are able to invest in quote-unquote risky asset classes like venture capital. There are, of course, markets, Israel being a great case, where venture capital is able to get a great amount of funding, but in many markets, this regulation, which was so useful to Silicon Valley and its success, has not traveled. Labor market flexibility, allowing talent to move, and as you say, Yesha, with the globalization and the movements, you would perhaps expect to see or want to see talent come to your locality if you're a policymaker. Again, this hasn't happened as much as it maybe is expected to, but increasingly policymakers are wanting to be an attractive locale in terms of labor market flexibility. Finally, ownership and investment restrictions may be related to foreign ownership of startups. Clusters, networks, institutes. We've all heard of these, so export processing zones, accelerators, science parks, co-working spaces, et cetera. Governments are investing in this as a tool for becoming a hub of venture activity. Attracting talent, again, how many have heard of Startup Chile? I think this is a great example, even though there's mixed reviews of the actual output of the Startup Chile initiative. It's at least been, if nothing else, a really fantastic way for the Chilean government to promote Chile as a center for innovation and for venture activity. I would expect that maybe some of those who raised their hands prior to Startup Chile being implemented would not have said, if they listed the top 10 places in the world where they would think that startup activity was happening, Chile may not have been first to your mind. So attracting talent and sort of putting yourself on the map as a location for innovation, for startup activity, is one of the tools that policymakers have now at their fingertips. Entrepreneur and startup visas as well. Investment promotion agencies, thinking of places like Invest Hong Kong, Invest HK. Bilateral investment funds, the Korea Israel Fund, the Core IL Fund, et cetera. Basically policymakers putting themselves on the map, on bringing talent to them and bringing money to them, to their locality as well. Technology infrastructure and government procurement, using the government pocketbooks in terms of procurement, and technology infrastructure, so allowing your developers to be able to innovate on the latest, and thinking of the example of Waze and the access or the need to have 3G. So if the local market is able to take advantage of the state of the art and the fastest, say, broadband access or internet access, of course you could expect that this would facilitate more and more activity in IT specifically. Living labs have been an effort by various localities. Buying and licensing software, also something that Taiwan did very effectively starting in the early 80s. Stock market access, this one is an easy one, right? So just literally creating a stock market, something like a local version of NASDAQ. Japan did this, Korea did this, Singapore has done this with Catalyst. And a stock market where small companies, where tech companies are able to more easily list than they would on the traditional larger, or AIM in London, the larger, more traditional maybe stock markets. And then related to that, decreasing the requirements for listing. In some markets, again, companies need to have, for example, 5 years of profitability before listing, which doesn't always fit with the startup business model. And the third point here is something that Israel's done very well, is allowing dual listings. Allow your local companies to list both on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange and abroad. 8, last but not least, education and training. And this is one of the issues in terms of government support of venture that is really something that is so holistic and long-term that governments have to be thinking 20, 30 years ahead in many cases. An example here, when I was in Vietnam last year, I had a number of policymakers telling me how excited they are that they're now introducing C++ programming in the 4th and 5th grade curriculum in Vietnam. So countries that maybe you wouldn't think of initially as places where there would be programming taught in elementary school are able to sort of leapfrog what maybe is taught in some of the Western education systems and have the the latest, maybe C++ isn't the latest, but having the access to the latest IT knowledge, effectively. Okay, great. So those are the 8. And then I just want to close with well, how do you do it well? So if these are the 8, and if governments were to go through this checklist and say, okay, we've done each of these, we've worked to bring in foreign investment, we've created a venture capital market, we've created our local stock market, we've done, ticking the boxes on each one of these. Is it simply a ticking the boxes exercise? No, of course it's not. Otherwise, there would be so many startup nations. Instead, there's this delicate balance of how to get the implementation of these policies right. So these are my sort of suggestions. And when I speak with policymakers and they ask me, well, how should we do it, and what are your recommendations based on what you've read and what you've seen? So in my humble opinion, if you will, so I think it's critical that governments have a really long-term view on implementing these venture policies, particularly with categories of policy efforts like education, of course, but even when it comes to funding. In some cases, a yozma like fund-to-fund has been implemented, and within 3 years, right, so 3 years within the creation of a venture capital fund-to-fund from the government, a government has said, wait a second, we haven't gotten our money back. Who would expect to get your money back from a VC fund-to-fund within 3 years? So legislators in this one country said, we want our money back, we don't have it back, we're shutting this program down. So it's essential that policymakers are long-term in their design and in their fortitude of waiting for a return on investment, if there is to be one or if there's expected to be one. Maintaining a sufficient risk appetite, which is related to this. In many cases, wanting to have some sort of return on investment, of course, is a good thing because you want to be investing in things that are or will be commercially viable. But that risk appetite needs to persist over time, again, and that's sort of hand in hand with the long-term investment horizon, which is basically be willing to lose the money and or have the money be illiquid for quite some time. Third, and several people have written about this very recently, don't try to copy Silicon Valley. If you try to copy Silicon Valley locally, it simply doesn't work. Silicon Valley is the unique confluence of 40 years of investments and culture and various inputs. And I think those that have read Startup Nation would also agree that Israel is the unique output of many different factors. And so it's critical to build on local advantages when designing these policies to support venture activity. Related to the risk appetite that I mentioned, co-investing with the private sector. If no private sector firms are willing to put money into a project that the government is willing to invest, then maybe it's not the best project for the government to invest in. I think this is an easy way of sort of means testing. Is this a project that's going to be commercially viable? If private sector individuals are willing to invest, you could expect that maybe this is something that has legs and can be self-sustaining in the future. And then on the other side, they're trying to avoid over-engineering support. So directing too much of what types of venture activity the government expects to come out of their support. So as Yasha mentioned, it's critical that the government helps to enable venture activity, but there needs to be enabling, not dictating. I'll give you one of my favorite personal examples of over-engineering that I actually quite like. It's funny in a way, actually. So in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew in the early 1980s had access to tremendous census data. And he found that the college-graduated men in Singapore were not marrying college-educated women. And he said, well, if we're building this developed society and we want our society to be a certain way, he said, I think we want our college-educated men to marry college-educated women. Okay, so how do you do that? How do you make that happen? one of the tools that he used, which didn't actually appear in my 8 categories, one of the tools he used was to offer college graduates effectively a free Club Med vacation, right? So he sort of facilitated dating opportunities for college-educated men and women. This, I think, would fall in the category perhaps of being over-engineered. So there's this fine line of bringing people to the dance, but then not telling them exactly what to do, because you cramp private sector funding. In some cases, in this Singaporean case, maybe it just ends up being awkward. The last 2 that I will close on relates to what I said before, this next one. So again, if private investors aren't willing to put money in, I think it's a sign for government folks that this isn't necessarily something that you want to be putting tax dollars into, which relates to the trend towards lowering tax rates and saying we'll be the latest low or no tax haven. Instead of moving to, we're going to offer a tax discount to attract you, think of perhaps other ways of attracting talent and of promoting local entrepreneurship instead of having to reduce the government's revenue, which effectively comes from tax revenue. Okay, I close there. Thank you very much.
This program was brought to you by Koller Institute of Venture at Tel Aviv University.